He adjusted his $5,000 tuxedo and sneered at his wife. "That's what you're wearing. That thing? It looks like you bought it at a thrift store, Alice." She stood silently in her simple navy dress, her hands clasped. Tonight was the biggest night of his career, the Metropolitan Innovators Gala, and she was going to embarrass him. He spent the first hour mocking her, letting his rivals laugh at her cheap outfit. But what Mark didn't know is that the most powerful man in the room, the reclusive billionaire Damian Wolf, was looking for one person, and when he found her, he bypassed kings and senators, walked straight up to Alice, and called her boss. The air in their penthouse apartment crackled with a familiar, toxic energy. Mark Peterson was preening, a peacock in a custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. He adjusted the onyx cufflinks, catching his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. He was, in his own mind, the epitome of Manhattan success. Tonight was the Metropolitan Innovators Gala at Cipriani South Street, the single most important networking event of the year. It was his chance to finally break out of the mid-level grind and into the stratosphere. "Alice, are you even ready?" he barked toward the master bedroom. "We're late." When Alice emerged, Mark's face, which had been set in a mask of smug anticipation, curdled into open disgust. Alice was a woman who seemed to blend into the background by design. She wasn't unattractive, but she held herself with a quiet reserve that, to a man like Mark, read as weakness. Tonight, she wore a silk sheath dress in a deep, unadorned navy blue. It had no labels, no sequins, no ostentatious branding. It was simple, elegant, and perfectly tailored. "That's it?" Mark gestured, his hand waving her up and down. "That's what you're wearing?" Alice paused, her hand smoothing the fabric at her waist. "I like it, Mark. It's comfortable." "Comfortable?" He let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Alice, this isn't a PTA meeting. This is the Innovators Gala. The Damian Wolf is rumored to be there. Do you see this tuxedo? This is $5,000. Do you see my watch? It's a Patek. I am building an image. And you show up looking like the help." The barb, meant to wound, landed with a dull thud. Alice had built up a thick callus against his words over the years. "I don't think anyone will be looking at me, Mark. They'll all be looking at you." "You're damn right they'll be looking at me, especially when they see who I brought," he snapped. "My God, it looks like you bought it at a thrift store. You have a joint checking account with a man who pulls in $500,000 a year. Why do you insist on embarrassing me?" He didn't know, of course, that the joint account was a performance. He didn't know that his $500,000 salary as a vice president at FinTech Solutions was a drop in the ocean. He didn't know that the penthouse he was so proud of, the car he drove, the very watch on his wrist, were all paid for by the woman he was currently comparing to a waitress. Alice had met Mark 8 years ago. He was ambitious and charming, and she was tired of being A.M. Mercer, the anonymous, almost mythical founder of Aura Core, a private technology firm so disruptive it was spoken of in whispers. She had wanted, for just a moment, to be normal, to be loved for Alice, not for A.M. So she had built a persona. She was a freelance graphic designer, a hobbyist. She tinkered on her computer in her home office, which was, in reality, the secure, encrypted server hub from which she ran a global billion-dollar company. Mark's ambition had quickly revealed itself as crippling insecurity, his charm a manipulative tool. He needed to be the big, successful man. To feed this, Alice had funneled a high-level job offer to him at FinTech Solutions, a company she secretly held a majority stake in, a fact unknown to its own board. She let him believe he was the provider. "Please, Mark," she said, her voice soft. "Let's not fight. It's your big night." "Whatever." He grabbed his coat. "Just try not to speak to anyone important, and for God's sake, stand up straight. You always look like you're apologizing for existing." He walked out the door, not even waiting for her. Alice stood alone for a moment in the marble foyer. She looked at her reflection. The dress wasn't just silk. It was a prototype, a smart fabric her labs had been developing for years, woven with microsensors that monitored biometrics. It was, quite literally, priceless. She sighed, picked up her simple clutch, and followed her husband into the night, a queen disguised as a pauper, walking willingly into her own humiliation. The black Escalade, another perk of Mark's job that Alice's company paid for, sliced through the downtown traffic. Mark was on his phone, scrolling through the gala's guest list, his thumb moving with a predatory speed. "Every shark in the city is here," he muttered, more to himself than to Alice. "The entire board of Wolf Dynamics, the partners from Sequoia. God, Sophia Langley is here." Alice's stomach tightened slightly at the name. Sophia Langley was Mark's direct competitor at FinTech Solutions. She was everything Alice was not: loud, aggressively fashionable, and dripping in designer labels. She also made no secret of her disdain for Alice and her open flirtation with Mark. When they arrived at Cipriani South Street, the flashbulbs were blinding. The venue was a temple of old-world money and new-world power. Mark stepped out of the car and immediately straightened his tie, offering a practiced smile to the photographers. He then turned and, as if remembering her, impatiently gestured for Alice. She stepped out, and the cameras, seeing her simple dress and lack of jewelry, turned away instantly. She was a non-entity. "See?" Mark hissed under his breath as they walked the long marble hall. "They know. You look like someone's assistant." Inside, the ballroom was breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the impossibly high, vaulted ceilings. The air hummed with the sound of 100 conversations, all strategic, all designed to appraise and impress. Mark, smelling opportunity, was instantly alive. "Right, I need to find my boss. You, go get a drink. Water. Don't drink champagne, you get flushed and look even more provincial. Just find a quiet corner, Alice." He didn't wait for a reply. He was gone, swallowed by a sea of tuxedos and couture gowns. Alice did as she was told. She found a small alcove near a towering floral display, took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and watched. This was, in its own way, her battlefield. She wasn't just a tech CEO, she was an analyst. She watched the power dynamics. She saw who was fawning, who held real power, and who, like her husband, was a desperate pretender. About 30 minutes into her solitary watch, she saw Mark. He had found his boss, a portly man named Robert, and standing right next to him was Sophia Langley. Sophia was a vision in fire-engine red Balenciaga, a massive diamond necklace, likely a rental, sparkling at her throat. She laughed, a loud, practiced sound, and touched Mark's arm. Even from across the room, Alice could see the possessive nature of the gesture. Then, the group's gaze shifted. They were looking directly at her. Sophia leaned in and whispered something to Mark. Mark winced, then smiled, a weak, embarrassed grimace. He said something back. Sophia laughed again, louder this time, and looked back at Alice with a look of pitying contempt. Alice knew, as if she could hear them, exactly what was said. "Is that your wife, Mark? How quaint." And Mark, instead of defending her, would have joined in. I know. She's a homebody. I can't get her to care about appearances." The casual, public betrayal stung more than the insults in their apartment. He wasn't just ashamed of her. He was using her as a social pawn, throwing her to the wolves to make himself look better, more relatable to his ambitious colleague. Alice took a slow, steadying breath. She felt a familiar coldness settling in her chest. It was the A.M. Mercer part of her, the CEO taking over, the part that analyzed threats, calculated damages, and made ruthless, final decisions, the part of her that hated being underestimated. She decided right then that the experiment of Alice Peterson was over. Tonight would be its end. She just needed to decide how. A sudden, palpable hush fell over the ballroom. The buzzing cacophony of 100 conversations didn't stop, but it dipped like a wave pulling back before a tsunami. The energy in the room shifted, pulling toward the grand entrance. Alice, from her vantage point, saw him first. He wasn't tall, but he commanded space as if he were a giant. Damien Wolfe. He was the king of this world, a tech visionary who had built his empire, Wolfe Dynamics, from his dorm room into a global force that dictated policy and shaped the future. He was notoriously reclusive, intensely private, and utterly brilliant. He never attended these events. His presence here meant something massive was happening. He wore a simple, impeccably cut black suit. No tie. His dark hair was threaded with silver, and his eyes, even from a distance, were sharp, analytical, and missed nothing. He was flanked by two stern-looking associates, but he walked with the confidence of a man who needed no protection. The sharks of the gala began to circle. People subtly, then obviously, began to move, trying to position themselves for an accidental introduction. Across the room, Mark Peterson looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "It's him," Alice heard him say to his boss, his voice giddy. "That's him. Robert, this is our chance. If I can get 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, to talk about our new platform." "Get in line, Peterson," his boss grunted, adjusting his own tie. "The entire room wants 5 minutes." But Mark was already moving. He was a man possessed. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Alice in her alcove. A terrible, wonderful idea seemed to strike him. He strode across the floor, ignoring the important people he had been flattering just moments before. He grabbed Alice's elbow, his fingers digging in. "What did I tell you?" he hissed, his face a mask of frantic energy. "He's here, Damien Wolfe. I'm going to introduce myself." "Mark, don't," Alice said, her voice low. "He doesn't like to be ambushed." "What would you know about it?" he spat. "You design logos for coffee shops. Now come with me." "Why?" "Because," he said, pulling her along, "people are intimidated by a direct approach. But a man with his quiet, simple wife, it's disarming. It's relatable. Now for God's sake, just smile, look pleasant, and do not talk." He was going to use her as a prop, a shield. The harmless, cheap-dressed wife would be his way in, a soft-looking non-threat to accompany his hard pitch. Alice let him pull her. She let him drag her through the glittering crowd, her simple navy dress a stark contrast to the sequins and silks she passed. She saw Sophia Langley watching them, a smirk on her face, as if to say, "Look at him, dragging his little anchor." They were getting closer. Damien Wolfe had been stopped by a senator, and his face was a mask of cold patience. He clearly wanted the conversation to end. "Now," Mark whispered, his palms visibly sweating. He saw his opening as the senator, rebuffed, moved away. Mark lunged, pulling Alice directly into the billionaire's path. "Mr. Wolfe, Mr. Wolfe, a moment of your time." Mark's voice was too loud, too eager. It cut through the refined hum of the room. Several people turned, cringing at the blatant, clumsy ambush. Damien Wolfe, who had been turning to speak to his associate, stopped. He turned his head slowly, and his steel-grey eyes landed on Mark. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Damien Wolf did not just look at people. He assessed them, and Mark was instantly found wanting. "Mr. Wolf," Mark said, his hand outstretched, a desperate, shiny smile plastered on his face. He was still holding Alice's arm in a vice grip. "Mark Peterson. I'm a VP with FinTech Solutions. I am a huge admirer of your work in the AI integration space. Truly, what you've done with Project Hyperion is—" Damien's gaze was blank. He made no move to take Mark's extended hand. The hand just hung there, limp and pathetic, in the air between them. The silence stretched. It was a humiliating, soul-crushing void. Mark's smile began to twitch. I have a proposal that I think could—" Mark stammered, his pitch dying in his throat. Sophia and Mark's boss, Robert, were watching from about 20 feet away. Robert had his eyes closed, as if in physical pain. Sophia was visibly enjoying the train wreck. "I am not here for proposals, Mr. Peterson," Damien Wolf said. His voice was quiet, but it carried, a blade cutting through the room. "You're interrupting my evening." Of course," Mark said, finally, agonizingly, lowering his hand. I thought, this is my wife, Alice." He gave Alice's arm a little shake, as if presenting his prop. "We're just so honored to be in the same room." He was hoping, pathetically, that the introduction of a wife would humanize him, would salvage the moment. It did. But not for him. Damien Wolf's gaze had been on Mark, a look of profound disinterest. But when Mark said the name Alice, his eyes flicked from Mark to the woman standing silently at his side. The change was instantaneous and absolute. The cold, dismissive mask vanished. Damien's sharp eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in dawning recognition, and finally in something that shocked every single person watching. Respect. Genuine, unadulterated respect. He took a half step forward, completely bypassing Mark as if he had ceased to exist. His entire focus was now on the woman in the cheap navy dress. "Alice," he said. His voice was no longer a blade, but a low, resonant baritone. "Alice. Mercer? AM? Mercer?" Mark froze. His head snapped between the billionaire and his wife. "What? Her name is Alice Peterson. What are you talking about?" Damien Wolf didn't even hear him. He was locked on to Alice. Alice, who had been silent for hours, finally lifted her chin. The meek, apologetic posture was gone. She looked Damien Wolf directly in the eye, and a small, knowing smile touched her lips. "Hello, Damien," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I was wondering if you'd make it." The sound of Alice's voice, so calm and familiar, striking the billionaire, sent a shock-wave through the immediate area. Mark's face, which had been pale with humiliation, was now a canvas of utter, slack-jawed confusion. You know him?" Mark stammered. "Alice, what is this?" Damien Wolf let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure appreciation. He looked from Alice back to the bewildered man beside her. "Know her?" Damien said. He stepped forward, inclining his head toward Alice in a gesture of deference that stunned the onlookers. "Mr. Peterson, I've been trying to get a one-on-one meeting with this woman for 2 years. My office has a standing order. If AM calls, I don't care if I'm in a meeting with the president, I take the call." He turned back to Alice, his eyes alight with professional admiration. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet you in person." "Boss." The word hung in the air, electric and definitive. "Boss." Mark's blood ran cold. "Boss? What is this? A joke? She's a..." She's a freelance designer. She makes logos. Alice, tell him. Tell him this is some mistake." Alice looked at her husband. The sadness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, clear finality. "There is no mistake, Mark." Damien Wolfe looked at Mark, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine curiosity, mixed with pity, entered his expression. "Peterson? You said your name was Peterson? And this is your wife?" "Yes," Mark shrieked, his voice cracking. "My God," Damien breathed, a look of horrified understanding dawning. He looked at Alice. "This is what you meant in your email about liquidating problematic assets." "Part of it," Alice said simply. "I don't understand," Mark shouted, now frantic. People were staring openly. Sophia and Robert had moved closer, their faces pale with shock. "What is AuraCore? What is AM?" "AuraCore," Damien Wolfe supplied, his voice laced with the reverence of a true believer, "is only the most disruptive private tech company on the planet. It's the firm that developed the Prometheus predictive AI engine, the one that every company, including my own, has been trying to acquire for the last 3 years. He gestured to Alice. This is A.M. Mercer, the founder, the CEO, the sole owner, the woman who just, as of last week, agreed to a merger with Wolf Dynamics, a merger that makes her, not to put too fine a point on it, the single largest private shareholder in my entire company. He looked back at Mark, his eyes turning to ice. So when I call her boss, it's not a pet name, Mr. Peterson. It's a statement of fact. She's my new partner. The silence that followed Damien's proclamation was absolute. It was not a polite hush. It was a vacuum, a void where all sound and motion had ceased. The tinkle of ice in a glass, the murmur of a distant conversation, the soft strains of the string quartet. All of it was gone, swallowed by the sheer, gravitational weight of that one, impossible word. Boss. Mark Peterson's face, which had cycled through pale with humiliation, was now a canvas of utter, slack-jawed confusion. His brain, which had been firing on all cylinders to find an in with Damien Wolfe, had completely stalled. It was like a machine fed an equation it could not compute. "What?" The word came out as a dry croak. "Well, what did you just say?" he stammered, his eyes darting wildly between the billionaire and his wife. He even managed a weak, terrified laugh, as if this were a bizarre, high-stakes practical joke he wasn't in on. "Mr. Wolfe, I don't understand. This is my wife, Alice Peterson. She's a freelance graphic designer. She makes logos." "Alice," he pleaded, giving her arm a frantic, desperate shake. "Alice, what is this? Tell him. Tell him this is some mistake. You don't know this man." Alice, who had been a statue of quiet endurance all night, finally turned her head. She didn't look at Mark. She looked at his hand, gripping her arm with a sweaty, panicked strength. She simply raised an eyebrow. With that one silent gesture, Mark's hand recoiled from her as if her skin had suddenly become superheated. He had never seen her look at him like that. Not with fear, or sadness, or anger, but with indifference, with the mild, analytical curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. Damien Wolfe, on the other hand, let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated appreciation. He looked from Alice's coolly composed face back to the bewildered, crumbling man beside her. "A mistake, Mr. Peterson?" Damien said, his voice laced with amusement. "No. The only mistake here is one you seem to have been making for a very, very long time." He took a half step back, effectively positioning himself at Alice's side, a silent, powerful alliance. He then addressed not just Mark, but the entire, silent, and now completely engrossed audience of New York's elite. For those of you who haven't been paying attention to the real future, Damien began, his voice carrying with the easy authority of a man who never had to raise it. Oracle is the most disruptive private technology firm on the planet. It is the mythical, anonymous company that for the last 5 years has been poaching the top engineers from Google, Apple, and, yes, my own company, Wolf Dynamics. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. These were names they understood. Oracle, he continued, is the firm that developed Prometheus, the only true predictive AI engine in existence, an engine that can analyze global market trends, geopolitical shifts, and even climate data to predict stock market fluctuations with 99.8% accuracy. It is the single most valuable piece of code ever written. Every bank on Wall Street, every government intelligence agency, and every tech conglomerate, including my own, has been trying to find its creator. We've been trying to acquire it, or failing that, to stop it. He gestured with an open palm to the woman in the simple navy dress. This, he said, is A.M. Mercer. The A.M. stands for Alice Mercer, the founder, the CEO, the sole architect of Prometheus, the woman who built a $1 trillion company from a spare bedroom and never once took a single dollar of venture capital. The silence, if possible, deepened. Jaws were, quite literally, on the floor. Damien wasn't finished. He looked at Mark again, his eyes turning to ice. So when I call her boss, Mr. Peterson, it is not a term of endearment. It is a statement of fact. As of last week, Oracle and Wolf Dynamics finalized the largest private merger in modern history, a deal that makes Alice Mercer the single largest private shareholder in my entire company. She is my new partner, and in many respects, she is now my boss. Mark's legs gave out. He physically stumbled back a step, catching himself on a small table, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. No, he whispered. No, 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 no. His mind was a kaleidoscope of broken images. Alice in her robe, her hair in a messy bun, tinkering on her laptop. Alice politely declining a new car because she was happy with her hybrid. Alice sitting in their penthouse, her penthouse, and listening to him brag about his $500,000 salary, a salary she had given him. Her office is the spare bedroom, he finally shrieked, the denial so strong it was making him hysterical. She told me she was tinkering. She makes logos for coffee shops. This time it was Alice who spoke. Her voice cut through his frantic denial, not with a shout, but with a cold, clear precision that was more devastating than any scream. That spare bedroom, Mark, she said, finally looking him in the eye, is a fully encrypted, climate-controlled server hub running on a quantum-cooled processor. It is a secure, direct link to my 3 main R&D labs in Tokyo, Berlin, and Austin. It has a redundant power supply linked to the building's core, and an independent, dedicated fiber line that no one else in this city can access. What you called tinkering, I called running a multi-billion-dollar global corporation. The sheer, staggering scale of the deception, the years of meticulous, layered, and effortless deceit crashed down on Mark. Every insult he had ever hurled, every time he had mocked her little hobby, every time he had flaunted his success in her face, all of it replayed in his mind, now cast in the hideous, fluorescent light of his own stupidity. Across the small gap, Sophia Langley looked as though she had been slapped. Her perfectly made-up face was a mask of chalky, pale horror. The smirk she had worn all night the casual contempt she had shown Alice, was gone. She was staring at Alice as if she were a ghost. This was the woman she had mocked. This was the woman whose husband she was actively trying to seduce. She hadn't just bet on the wrong horse, she had insulted the owner of the entire racetrack. Her career, which was tethered to Mark's, was over. She knew it. Robert, Mark's boss, looked even worse. He was sweating profusely, his face a blotchy, terrified red. He was doing rapid, panicked mental calculations. FinTech Solutions, Alice Peterson, A.M. Mercer. Oracore, Robert whispered, his voice trembling. He took a half step forward, his hands raised as if in supplication, completely ignoring the subordinate who was currently having a meltdown. My God, that Oracore, Ms. Mercer, I had no idea. Absolutely no idea. On behalf of FinTech Solutions, But this, of course, led to the second, more brutal twist. Damien Wolfe, ever the analyst, looked at Robert and then back at Mark. FinTech Solutions. FinTech Solutions. Why do I know that name? He mused, tapping his chin. Ah, yes. He snapped his fingers. They're one of the half-dozen mid-level firms that have been desperately, and rather pathetically, trying to license the Prometheus engine for the last 6 months. Weren't they? He asked Alice, a small smile playing on his lips. Alice nodded, her gaze locking back onto her husband. The ice in her eyes was now mixed with a fire of pure, righteous judgment. Their proposals have been persistent, Alice said, her voice dripping with cold condescension, and consistently underwhelming. I believe, she added, her voice dropping. You yourself were put in charge of the Oracore pitch last month, weren't you, Mark? Mark's blood, which had been boiling with panic, turned to solid ice. He stopped breathing. Alice continued, her words methodical, each one a separate, precise stab. You complained for weeks. You said you couldn't get a meeting with that impossible bitch A.M. Mercer. You told me, as I was making you dinner, that she was an arrogant, invisible coward who wouldn't even take a phone call. She took a step closer to him. You told me, she whispered, that if you could just get her in a room, you'd charm her into signing. You said she probably just needed a man to explain the business side of it to her. The color drained completely from Mark's face. He had been trying to pitch his own wife. He had been complaining to his wife about his inability to get a meeting with his wife. The woman he had mocked, belittled, and ignored held the future of his entire company, his entire career, in the palm of her hand. And he had just spent the last 3 hours publicly, loudly, and viciously humiliating her. Oh, Mark, Sophia breathed, taking a large, instinctive step away from him. He was no longer a colleague. He was radioactive. He was a dead man. Robert looked like he was going to have an aneurysm. His career was flashing before his eyes. He had tethered his division to this fool. Ms. Mercer, Alice, Robert began, I can assure you, Mr. Peterson's behavior is not reflective of our company's values. Save it, Robert, Damien Wolfe cut in, his voice bored. He had lost interest in the collateral damage. He had seen enough. He turned back to Alice, his focus entirely on what mattered. Now, Alice, about this dress. The conversational pivot was so sharp, it gave everyone whiplash. Mark, Sophia, and Robert all looked, confused at the cheap navy dress. I'm glad you appreciate it, Alice said. It's quite comfortable. Appreciate it? Damien reached out but did not touch, his fingers hovering over the fabric with the reverence of an engineer. This is the A1 prototype, isn't it? The thermo-regulating smart fabric weave. My God, it's real. My defense tech division has been salivating over the patent specs for this. We estimated it was 5 years from viability. We had a breakthrough 3 months ago, Alice said simply. My Austin lab perfected the fiber optic threading. This is the first wearable. It's monitoring my vitals, the ambient climate, and adjusting its own fiber density in real time. It's also, she added as an afterthought, bullet-resistant up to a .22 caliber. The cheap thrift store dress, the very symbol of Mark's shame, was, in fact, a piece of revolutionary, priceless technology that no one else in the world possessed. It was worth more than every car, watch, and diamond in the entire ballroom combined. It was, just like Alice, an unassuming package of terrifying, hidden power. Damien Wolfe looked at Alice with unrestrained, unfiltered awe. "You are, without a doubt," he breathed, "the most brilliant person in this room, AM." He then looked at Mark Peterson one last time. Mark was no longer a man. He was a crater, a smoking ruin of a human being. Damien's gaze was not one of anger or even contempt. It was a simple, biological assessment, like a scientist looking at a failed experiment in a petri dish. "And you," he said, his voice quiet but echoing in the profound silence, "are the luckiest man I've ever met." He paused, then added, "And also, I suspect, the stupidest." Damien Wolfe, having delivered a verdict that had rewritten the entire social and financial landscape of the room, dismissed Mark from his reality. He had assessed the threat, neutralized it with information, and was now moving on. He turned his full, undivided attention to Alice, offering her his arm with a formal, respectful grace. "Now, Alice," he said, his voice warm, a stark contrast to the ice he had just deployed. "You and I are long overdue for a real conversation. My partners for the Tokyo expansion are in the private lounge upstairs. They flew in from Singapore just to get a chance to meet you, AM. Shall we?" Alice looked at Mark. He was no longer a man. He was a hollow shell, a collapsed building of ego and ambition. His face was vacant, his jaw slack, his $5,000 tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume on a mannequin. He had lost everything. His wife, his job, his reputation, his future, all in the span of 5 minutes, all by his own arrogant, dismissive hand. She felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. She felt a profound, deep and cleansing relief. It was the feeling of a 20-pound weight being lifted from her shoulders. The 8-year performance, the exhausting charade of Alice Peterson, was over. The curtain had come down. "Yes, Damien," she said. Her voice, no longer meek, was clear and resonant. She placed her hand on the billionaire's arm, a simple physical act that was, in this room, a coronation. It was an alignment of power, a public declaration of her true station. As they began to turn away, a path clearing before them, as if by magic, the shock that had paralyzed Mark Peterson finally broke. It was replaced not by shame or remorse or even fear, but by a desperate, primal, and pathetic rage. The core of his entitlement, the belief that he deserved all this, finally erupted. "Alice!" The name was not spoken. It was shrieked. It was a raw, animalistic sound that was utterly wrong for the gilded, sophisticated ballroom of Cipriani. Every head, which had been politely trying to look away, snapped back to the trio. Before Damien's security could even react, Mark lunged. He was not thinking. He was pure, wounded animal. He grabbed Alice's arm, her other arm, the one he had been dragging her by all night, his fingers digging in like claws. "Alice, you can't!" he screamed, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. "You can't do this! You're my wife! We are married! What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine!" He tugged at her, trying to physically pull her away from Damien Wolfe, as if she were a possession he was reclaiming. "The house, the cars, the money, that's ours. You think you can just walk away with all of it? No. You owe me. You owe me, Alice. You owe me for the last 8 years. The sheer, staggering audacity of the claim that she owed him made even Damien pause. The billionaire didn't flinch. He simply looked down at Mark's grasping, white-knuckled hand on Alice's arm, and then back at Alice. He wasn't going to intervene, not yet. This was her show. He was just a spectator. Alice stopped. She didn't struggle. She didn't wince. She just stopped. She turned her head, not to look at Mark's face, but to look down at his hand, still clawing at the priceless, prototype fabric of her dress. She stared at his fingers as if they were a particularly disgusting species of insect. She spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was a blade, so cold and so clear that it seemed to silence the entire ballroom, sucking the very air from the room. "Take your hand off me, Mark." "No!" he cried, his grip tightening. His eyes were wild, darting between Alice, Damien, and the horrified faces of the crowd. He knew he was ruined, but he was going to drag her down with him. "I'm not letting you go. You're going to destroy me, aren't you? This was all a trap. You planned this. The dress, the billionaire, all of it. You were playing me." Alice finally, slowly, lifted her gaze from his hand to his face. "No, Mark," she corrected, her voice devoid of all emotion, save for a chilling finality. "You're wrong. You made yourself look like a fool. I just provided the mirror." His face contorted, and he opened his mouth to scream again, but she cut him off. "I am not Alice Peterson. That woman. The one you ignored. The one you left in corners. The one you called provincial and cheap. She was a ghost. She was a character I played, Mark. A role. And the performance," she said, "is over." She took a small, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to take an involuntary step back, though he never released his grip. "The woman you thought you married, the harmless little hobbyist who tinkered in the spare room. She doesn't exist. She was a lie. A lie you were too arrogant, too self-absorbed, and too profoundly stupid to ever even question." She held his gaze, her eyes like chips of ice. "My name is Alice Mercer, and you and I have nothing left to talk about. Not now, not ever." That was the breaking point. The finality in her voice, the absolute lack of an Alice he recognized, snapped the last thread of his sanity. The realization that he had no leverage, no power, and no future coalesced into a single, violent impulse. His entitlement turned to pure, undiluted rage. You bitch," he snarled. The word ripped from his throat. His face went purple. The veins on his neck stood out like cords. He had lost all control. He let go of her arm only to rear back his other hand, his right hand, balling it into a fist. He was going to strike her. In front of the most powerful people in New York, his final, pathetic act was to be one of public, domestic violence. The crowd gasped as one. Several women screamed. "Mr. Wolf, step back!" yelled a man from Damien's security detail, his hand flying inside his jacket. But Alice was faster. She had been running threat assessments her entire life. A man like Mark, cornered and humiliated, was predictable. He didn't just swing. He lunged, putting all of his 190 pounds into the movement, a clumsy, furious, telegraphed attack. Alice didn't resist. She didn't back away. She yielded. She stepped into the attack, moving inside the arc of his swing. In one fluid, economical motion, she caught his outstretched wrist with her left hand, sank her weight, and rotated her hips. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a kick. It was a simple, brutal, and perfectly executed Aikido throw. She used his own momentum, his own rage, his own weight, and simply redirected it. Mark, caught completely off balance, went airborne. He flew past her, over her hip, in a clumsy, flailing arc. He was no longer a threat. He was just a projectile, and his target was the magnificent 20-tier champagne tower that stood as the gala's centerpiece. The sound was apocalyptic. It was not a crash. It was a cathedral of shattering glass, an explosion of crystal and alcohol. The entire glittering structure collapsed in on itself. Mark Peterson landed in the center of the wreckage, a pathetic, groaning heap of ice, broken flutes, and spilled Dom Perignon. He was drenched. The sticky, cold liquid soaked his $5,000 tuxedo. He was bleeding. A shard from a broken flute had sliced open his hand, the same hand he had raised to strike her. He lay there, whimpering, smelling of yeast and failure. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. Every person in the ballroom was frozen, staring at the carnage. Alice hadn't even mussed her hair. She stood, perfectly balanced, as if she had just completed a yoga pose. She calmly smoothed the fabric of her cheap dress, the priceless prototype, of course, completely unharmed. Damien Wolfe was the first to recover. He stared at the wreckage, then at Alice, and he was, for the first time that night, visibly impressed. He motioned to his security chief, who was still standing with his hand on his weapon. "Stand down, Arthur," Damien said, his voice laced with stunned amusement. "I believe Miss Mercer has the situation entirely in hand." He turned back to Alice, a slow, broad smile of pure respect spreading across his face. "Alice," he said, his voice low, "I have a legal team that costs me 8 figures a year. They are, to a man, sharks. Tell me, are your lawyers as efficient as you are?" Alice finally allowed herself a small, tight smile. "More so, Damien," she replied. "They're my employees. They work for Oracor's internal legal division, and they've had the divorce papers drawn up for 6 months, citing irreconcilable differences." She tapped a tiny, invisible comms device in her ear. "But I signed the finalized papers this morning. I was just waiting for a public, undeniable and emotional breach of contract to finalize the with cause addendum. His ongoing adultery with Miss Langley, which my security team has been fastidiously documenting, was sufficient. But this," she gestured to the shattered glass and the groaning man, "this public assault is just so much cleaner." She looked back at Damien. "My security detail, by the way, has been live streaming high-definition video of Mark's behavior directly to my legal server for the last 10 minutes. I believe we have everything we need to ensure the dissolution of assets is amicable, meaning he gets nothing." The entire gala had been her stage. She had set it, knowing he would self-destruct. Now, it was time for the cleanup. She turned her head, her gaze sweeping over the crowd and landing on Robert, Mark's now former boss. He was trying to back out of the ballroom, his face the color of spoiled milk. "Robert," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was a gunshot in the silent room. He froze, his back to a pillar. "Yes, Ms. Mercer." "Your firm, FinTech Solutions, has been a parasite on my portfolio for 2 years. Mark's presence there was the only reason I allowed it to continue to operate at a loss. Your proposals to license the Prometheus engine weren't underwhelming, they were insulting. You demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the technology you were trying to buy." Robert began to hyperventilate. "Oracor's merger with Wolf Dynamics," she continued, "makes your entire platform, your business model, and your R&D division completely and utterly obsolete. As the majority stakeholder in your parent company, a fact you will see in an email that hit your inbox about 5 minutes ago, I am liquidating the entire fintech branch. This isn't a 2-week notice. This is a dissolution, effective immediately. Your security key was deactivated 3 minutes ago." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You should probably call your wife, Robert. And in the future, never ever let a man like that," she gestured to Mark, who was now being hauled to his feet by 2 very stern gala security guards, "represent your company." Her gaze swept past him and landed on Sophia Langley. Sophia was petrified, her red Balenciaga dress looking garish and cheap under the harsh light. She was trying to slip away, to melt into the stunned crowd. "Ms. Langley," Alice called out. Sophia froze, her back to Alice. She couldn't even turn around. Alice didn't need her to. She looked at Damien. "Damien, your HR division is, I assume, top-notch?" Damien, following her gaze to Sophia, caught on immediately. "The best, Alice. Why?" "Good," Alice said. "Then they'll have no trouble flagging Ms. Langley's resume when it inevitably crosses their desk. For that matter, they should probably flag her for all of our subsidiaries, and perhaps our partners as well. Her aggressive networking style," she said, loading the words with meaning, "poses a significant liability risk. I'm sure my legal team can forward you the extensive file they've compiled on her indiscretions with Mr. Peterson." It was a total, complete, and utter blackballing. She hadn't just fired her. She had ended her career in this industry. Sophia let out a small, strangled sound, like a dying animal. She clutched her rented necklace and bolted, pushing through the stunned crowd and disappearing out the main entrance. The room was now clear of threats. Mark was being dragged out by security, moaning about his hand. Robert was sliding down the pillar, his phone to his ear. The storm had passed. Alice turned back to Damien Wolfe. She was calm, serene, as if she had just finished a tedious board meeting. "Now," she said, her voice bright. "You were saying something about your partners from Singapore." Damien Wolfe just stared at her for a beat. The man who controlled the global tech market, who could make or break nations with a single decision, looked at her with pure, unadulterated awe. "Alice Mercer," he said, finally offering his arm again. "You are, without a doubt, the most terrifying and brilliant person I have ever met." "You should see my quarterly projections, Damien," she replied, placing her hand on his arm. "Let's go. We have work to do." They walked toward the grand staircase. The crowd didn't just part. They recoiled. They moved back, creating a wide, clear path, as if for royalty. They were afraid of her. They admired her. And they would never, ever underestimate her again. As they reached the first landing, ascending above the mess, Damien leaned in, his voice for her ears only. "You know," he murmured, "the merger contracts are final. The divorce was filed. You didn't have to do any of this. You could have just left him. You could have walked out of your penthouse this morning and never looked back." Alice paused. She stopped on the landing, looking out over the ballroom. She saw the shattered glass. She saw the waiters, who were now emerging to clean up the spilled champagne. She saw the last of Mark Peterson being escorted out a side door, a pathetic, soaked and defeated figure. "You're right, Damien," she said, her voice quiet. "I could have. I didn't do this for the merger. I didn't even do it for the divorce. That was all just paperwork." "Then why?" he asked. "Why this public execution?" Alice turned and continued walking up the stairs, her back straight, her head high, leaving the ruins of her old life behind. "For 8 years," she said, "he made me feel small. He made me feel cheap. He made me feel invisible. He took my silence for weakness and my kindness for stupidity. Tonight, I just needed him, and everyone who laughed with him, to know, for one perfect, crystal-clear moment. She reached the top of the stairs, turning to look back one last time at the wreckage, a queen surveying her new, conquered territory. Exactly who he was embarrassing. And just like that, Mark Peterson learned that the person you disrespect is often the one holding all the cards. He didn't just lose his wife, he lost his job, his reputation, and his entire future, all because he judged a book by its cheap cover. Alice Mercer, on the other hand, had finally shed the one part of her life that was holding her back, stepping out of the shadows and into the power that was always hers. This story is a powerful reminder. Never, ever underestimate the quiet ones. True power doesn't need to be loud. True worth doesn't need a designer label. What did you think of Mark's downfall? Was it karma, or was it just business? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe for more real-life drama stories just like this one.
There's the pigeon.